The following podcast is a little fiery but mostly peaceful. If you're an automaton, turn away now and shelter in place. If you're a Catholic ready to renew your prescriptions of red pills and white pills, stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Catholics Aren't Zombies. I'm your host, Chris Munier. Delighted to have you once again. Well, okay, mea culpa. Sometimes it's a little hard to admit when you are wrong about things, but you gotta do it. That's part of being Catholic, going to confession. You gotta do it sometimes, and it can be frustrating. I'm gonna have to admit something I've been a little bit guilty of, and I think I'm not alone on this, so I'm gonna share it for the purposes of not only correcting my own mistake, but also perhaps encouraging others to follow suit with this. This is gonna be having to do with criticism of Pope Francis. Before I get into what I think the problem is, I fully realize that many of us, myself included, intuitively have some problems with the stuff that Pope Francis says. And, this could be extended to many of the bishops, clergy, folks that call themselves theologians since the 1950s or 60s, have to say about the Catholic Church, its dogma, its doctrines, its disciplines, the whole nine yards. So what I'm about to say is not me making some bizarre conversion all the way to, Nouvelle Théologie or becoming a James Martin modernist Jesuit type. I'm not going that route. I didn't just, flip the switch or something like that. I'm not converting to the dark side, so to speak. I still have my problems with what the overwhelming majority of what comes from churchmen these days. But what I want to talk about is this potential of running into this ugly habit of murmuring and muttering and just unabashedly criticizing and castigating, particularly the Holy Father. Yes, I acknowledge that not everything the Pope says is automatically infallible, de fide, all that sort of stuff. Just because the Pope says it doesn't mean it's on exactly the same level as what appears in the Gospel. There's many, many layers to church magisterium, and common sense would tell you that not every off-the-cuff comment that the Pope makes on an airplane, at a press conference, or even during a homily has to be taken without any discernment. I don't buy into this modern sentiment that the Pope can basically walk into Dunkin' Donuts, wave his hand around, and select what appears to be the infallible donut. We can take this idea of papal infallibility to an absurd level that will make us look like a laughingstock and actually will confirm the suspicions that Protestants have that we really are just papalatrists. I don't want to go that far, but we've got to get back to basics a little bit and understand that you can't just openly murmur, criticize, and castigate the Pope. There is still a such thing as obedience. And I, as somebody that's just, got done writing a book about the topics of authority and obedience, I fully acknowledge that there's a lot to get into with that topic. There's a lot of ways to get confused and, a whole tangle web of problems. And as much as I think the concepts of authority has been mutilated and distorted into a Frankenstein these days, it still exists. There is still something called church authority. But I have to admit, I have been mistaken, and even I've made the mistake of getting a little too sarcastic about the Pope, a little too rude, disrespectful. Think about, here, let me give you something concrete. How about the difference between St. Catherine of Siena and Martin Luther? Both of them took exception to the way their respective pope at the time was behaving. St. Catherine of Siena wrote private letters to the Pope, basically asking him to come back to Rome out of Avignon, France, wanted to end this confusing, bizarre Avignon papacy. But notice what she did. She didn't go and set up some kind of insurrectionist rally trying to get people riled up against the Pope. No, she wrote private letters, respectfully, without calling out or damaging the dignity of the Pope. Contrast that with Martin Luther. What did he do? In his desperate attempt for attention, because that's what he wanted, he goes and posts a big old proclamation on the door. It's basically an agitprop mission to get people riled up against the Pope. And unfortunately, it worked. So two different approaches to this idea of, perhaps opposing Cephas to his face. But here's the thing, unless you're a bishop or a cardinal, you're really kind of not supposed to oppose Cephas to his face. St. Catherine of Siena, I think, understood that. If she opposed him, perhaps, I don't think that's the right word. She did it quietly and politely behind the scenes, and we found out about it later. Martin Luther, on the other hand, well, he thinks he knows better. He can interpret Holy Scripture without the need of any authoritative aid. He goes and tells the Pope exactly what's on his mind. And the rest is history. It created a big old schism in the church. So St. Catherine of Siena's approach ultimately was a big healing instrument for the church. It eventually, I think, did contribute to the reunification of the Roman pontiff in Rome. Martin Luther, on the other hand, created one of the greatest, ugliest disintegrations of Christendom in history. Like the only other one that might have been worse was the East-West Schism. I've had to remind myself of this issue lately because I know it's easy to get caught up with this mania of the times where, the church has been infiltrated. I've made the case in Caesar Vacantism that the state has been more than infiltrated. We're in pretty bad shape, and our churchmen and statesmen and elites and people in authority, legitimate authority or otherwise, have more or less seemed to have led us down a sewer. But it doesn't mean that the concept of authority, or these institutions, particularly ones that are guarded by the Holy Spirit, like the Catholic Church, have all of a sudden been destroyed. The gates of hell will not prevail against Holy Mother Church. And I think maybe in some subtle way we have forgotten. And insofar as we make the sarcastic remarks against the Pope, it sort of seems like in a small way we've done that. I could make a case that, traditionally that was viewed as a mortal sin. And another thing that may be viewed as a mortal sin is lay people trying to determine, like the Sedevacantist do, whether the claimant to the papacy is even legitimate. Is it our place to talk about whether these papal conclaves are legit, whether the elections are legit? Traditionally, I think 100 or 200 years ago, the overwhelming consensus would have been most certainly no. This is a totally new thing. We ought to at least be a little wary of it. I've made my mistakes. I took a couple of my posts down off my blog, and I want to make it clear that I'm putting my money where my mouth is. This isn't just a problem that I see from other people. I had an article, it was, 29 questions for Pope Francis. And even though in the article I said, hey, I'm not putting the Pope to the test, these are legit questions. If I'm honest about it, well, yeah, they were kind of snarky. Out of the 29 questions, I think many of them were legitimate, and I'd still stand behind it. But you kind of lose your entire point when you devolve into snarky, sarcastic, sardonic comments. Also, even in Caesar Vacantism, I don't overwhelmingly, I don't spend a whole lot of time on the concept of church infiltration, of which I think there is an issue with that. We know that there were communists and Freemasons who infiltrated the church all those years ago. I don't spend a ton of time on this, but I'll admit I did say a couple of things that I would like to perhaps expunge or correct. There's this thing that Taylor Marshall has said a couple times that, Pope Francis might be the worst pope in the history. All right, ultimately, we as lay people, PhDs or not, really do not have the authority or position to say that. You just ask yourself, would St. Francis of Assisi made a claim like that? Would St. Teresa of Avila said something like that? Even St. Paul, who, famously opposed Cephas to his face, would they make that kind of claim? It's a little hard to imagine that. Now, as I said, I don't want to make this appear as though I've gone soft. And I wrote a whole article about this, and it's on ditchthestateloveholychurch.com. I don't want to make it look like I just went soft. Oh, the Jesuits, they converted me. They beat me. I can't handle it no more. I'm not going that route. All I'm trying to do is acknowledge what has basically always been pious tradition, that you don't talk smack about the Pope, regardless of what the issues are. You don't have to blindly believe everything he says in a press conference, but there is still dignity of the office, regardless of the office holder, whether it's Pope Francis, Boniface VIII, Alexander VI or the VII, I forget which one was the one that had all the accusations. These might be folks who have legitimate, verifiable allegations against them, but it doesn't change the fact that, again, their office is sacred and indeed divinely protected. There can't be a long-term sedevacantist position. That's against church teaching. I'm not going to go into every detail as to why, but there's no way you would have gotten a St. Thomas Aquinas or a St. Robert Bellarmine or a St. Alphonsus Liguori to go along with all this calumny and backbiting and sedevacantist crap. There's no way. I want to read something from you real quick just to show a little bit of inspiration for what I'm saying. I'm going to post a link in the show notes, But there's this article I read by, I guess it's the website about religious vocations, and the author, who they don't have their name on here, but the author was making the point that there are three really important marks of an authentic Catholic. And this is especially important for the consecrated religious, but for any Catholics. Three things that you gotta nail down, or how can you say that you're a legit Catholic? One of them is fidelity to the Pope, love of the Holy Eucharist, and devotion to Mary. These are three things that almost any saint would agree on. Let me read a paragraph to you to give you an idea what I'm talking about. Under this section of fidelity to the Pope, quote, "It is for this reason that criticism in a community, especially of the Pope, is a manifest sign of a poorly formed faith. The saints are very clear on this point. It's not enough to just speak well of their own superior, but their obedience must extend up through the church as well. This is not to say that one cannot disagree with certain actions or words of the current Holy Father. However, to do so publicly shows a certain level of imprudence and lack of discretion. If one wants to criticize the Pope, there are many Protestant denominations and schismatic sects one can join where they can criticize all they want and cease making any progress on the path to perfection. But as Catholics, we do not uncover the wounds of those in our family needlessly. There is not one saint in history who is known for criticizing the Pope at table, nor during recreation, nor even at the pulpit. And if the Church persecuted the saints unjustly, like, say, St. Joan of Arc, they would obediently submit to their Holy Mother without question. Some may object and point to St. Catherine of Siena, for example, but this rare example is an exception, not the rule. And what is more, she did so hidden from other people through private letters sent directly to the Pope in an effort to compel him to return to Rome. Never once did she criticize the Pope in her writings and in her public life. And yet some groups today who claim to be Catholic do nothing but criticize in their writings and public life. And this criticism does nothing but breed a spirit of cynicism and pride in their flock. There is no humility in any of these sects, and for this reason alone, it is antithetical to the religious state," close quote. And by extension, the rest of us as well. This is not just about consecrated religious. So I invite folks to maybe think about this a little bit more the next time, even if you read something from Archbishop Vigano, who I think has got many, many good points. But again, he's got Archbishop in front of his name. And I think even for him, it's going to be a very precarious endeavor. Hence, probably why he waited so long to do it. There's the other thing. Even amongst the high-ranking prelates who have, let's say, more or less voiced a concern, dubias, filial corrections, you've noticed that they seem rather reluctant to do it. And I think that's for a very important reason, that within church tradition, this is not something you do haphazardly. This is not something you do off the cuff. And as you do it, there is a certain level of deference that still has to be maintained. And look, guys, I'm definitely not telling you that you've got to be in full agreement or full comprehension of something like Amoris Laetitia. Okay, we know there's pre-existing church magisterium that contradicts that. So one pope comes along and says something that seems drastically out of line with prior church teaching. Yeah, you're not immediately bound to take it hook, line, and sinker. It might be a cause to think about a particular topic, but this doesn't mean that, he all of a sudden somehow just rewrote dogma or rewrote doctrine. You can't do that. Bottom line, and I'm going to wrap this up, is that in this golden age, this not so golden age of Twitter and an internet message board pissing contests, we are running into a very real danger of perhaps inadvertently, but definitively detracting against persons of high office that we are compelled to be deferent toward. Whether we like their personality or not, whether we like what's happened with this infiltration of the church, of the state or not. And even you could compare this criticism of the state with criticism of the church. You can get away with criticizing the state. I mean, there's nothing sacred about them. There's nothing sacred about that stupid Capitol building that they besieged recently. A lot more gray area when it comes to politics. But when it comes to the church stuff, find there is the recognize and resist element, but it can't be a vehement, antagonistic opposition. So I invite folks to think really hard about this, and don't let as usual, don't let your understanding of this stop with what you hear from me. This is something I think we're going to have to really wrestle with in our minds. We're going to have to talk to each other about. We may have to get, the parish priests, pick their brain on it. I don't know, maybe they're saying the wrong stuff from the pulpit. We're used to thinking that the only time they can say something bad is when they just, leave out church teaching or they teach some modernist crap. And that's still a problem. But have they inadvertently, accidentally drifted into something detractive? Well, if that's the case, then maybe they need some correction there too. Maybe they need our help on that as well. So, not trying to get super mushy about this. I didn't fall, like I said, I didn't fall in love with the new Nouvelle Theologie or anything. I'm not a von Balthasar, Karl Rahner kind of guy. But we do got to be really careful about how we're phrasing these things. To thine own self be true. So, that's the story for today. Mea culpa, but God bless. Let's try to stay on the right track as best as we possibly can. Nobody's perfect. Appreciate you listening to my show. Check out my blog, Ditch the State, loveholychurch.com. I've got a whole article that mirrors this whole topic. And then check out my book, Caesar Vacantism, Rendering to Caesar, When Caesar Goes Nuts. That's available on Amazon. And click the subscribe button. Subscribe. All right, adios. Cue the music.